Okay, hey, good morning, guys. How's everyone doing? Like I said, I wanted to give you some quick notes on, we'll see how quick, but quick notes on chapters 2 through 4 in preparation for the short essay on Thursday on No Red Ink. And you would be scheduled to take that during the time that your class would be scheduled to meet on a G day. Um, so you want to check your schedule for that. So at the end of chapter 1, as I referenced before, you have this framing device of the beginning of the book and the end of the book, or the beginning of the story and the end of the story. So when Vonnegut says, listen, the story's going to begin like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. That's going to be the first two lines of chapter 2. And he tells you what the last line of the book is going to be as well. So this beginning of chapter 2 is important to begin Billy Pilgrim's story, and also with this concept of being unstuck in time. And time, as I said before, is really a central idea in the novel, and it's also central to the structure of the novel. So the idea that Billy Pilgrim is someone who time travels in such a way that it's not chronological or linear. He jumps and as it says here, comes unstuck. So he's in time and then he comes unstuck and he ends up in these different places in his past or in his future. And so the structure, that really mirrors the structure of the book, which is not going to be linear or chronological in any way, but rather jump through time continuously. And this is really reflective of the view of time as seen by the Tremalfadorians, which Billy is going to be exposed to here pretty shortly. But you can see in the next paragraph, it describes this process, or this idea of coming unstuck in time when he goes to sleep as a senile widower and he awakens on his wedding day. He's gone backwards. He's walked through a door in 1954 and come out another one in 1941. He's gone back to the door to find himself in 1963. He's seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between. He says, and that, of course, introduces that idea of uncertainty or possible unreliability. This idea of, even though it then jumps to, oh, he was born in this period or born in this date and in this place, and it kind of gives you a little bit of his background. Going back to the beginning, it's the story of Billy Pilgrim is one that's going to jump back and forth throughout time during the course of the novel. And also during the course of the novel, you're going to have these periodic interruptions of Vonnegut, the author, coming in as well and inserting himself and making connections between what Billy might have had happen to him in Dresden and what Vonnegut had happened to him during his experiences during the war as well. So a little bit further into chapter 2 here, he's going to expand upon this idea of the Tralfamador's concept of time and space. He mentions they could see in 4 dimensions, and they pitied Earthlings for only being able to see in 3. And this is going to be something that comes up quite a bit. The idea that human perception is limited by these three dimensions, and it's what we can't see that is often the most significant or the most important. And so we're only seeing a limited perspective of really what's out there and what life is, or what our lives consist of. And so that limited perspective and the decisions and judgments that we make based upon that are always going to be flawed, because we don't have this complete concept of life or of the universe as the Tralfamadors do. So the concept here of the 3 dimensions, which are really represent the material world or the physical world of height, width, and depth. And we talk about the physical presence of something. But the 4th dimension, which is what the Tralfamadors can experience and see, is famously, as it says here, revealed by Einstein as representing time. So time being this 4th dimension. So it's time and space rather than just space. And this is what the limitation that most earthlings, as they would say, have is that they're not really able to see or experience life in this way. Now, Billy Pilgrim, to a certain extent, is living in this fourth dimension. He has been exposed to this concept of time, not that he can see it, but that he experiences it. And so his experience then, and what he learns and what he goes through during that experience, is now being transferred, or meant to be transferred, to the reader in order to give the reader a better perspective about time. So to expand upon this, as they explain, as Billy Pilgrim explains, he says, the most important thing I learned on Tralfamadore was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He's still very much alive in the past, so it is silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed and always will exist. And so, in a sense, what he's referring to here, especially in terms of the past, is this idea of memory, and that you can relive moments and experiences. Now, he feels like he's actually literally reliving them and jumping through time, coming unstuck in time and moving through these in a fluid way. But certainly anyone in the present can remember the past and can re-experience the past through the power of their memory. So the idea here is that things are never lost. Things are always present. All parts of your life are present all at once. And as he said, they have certain powers where they can sort of control it. Billy Pilgrim doesn't really have that control. He just sort of randomly moves through time. But they can see how permanent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment that interests them. And so they have this ability to do that and to sort of go back and rewind and fast forward to all these different aspects, parts of their life. So they're not limited to just thinking of the present and the past and the future as these separate concepts. It's all one shared continuum. As he says, it's an illusion that we have on Earth that one moment follows another one like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it's gone forever. The moment's always there in this world, and to a certain extent in our world too, when we're talking about memory. But this is where he also reveals this concept of so it goes. The idea that in Tralfamadorian sees a dead person, they just think, oh, in this particular moment they're in a bad situation, but there's other moments where they're fine. And so what they say about dead people is so it goes. And it's kind of like a whatever statement. And this is what Billy Pilgrim has adopted as well. And as the voice of the narrator, the phrase "so it goes" is repeated throughout the book, is usually in response to in reaction to response to death. And so it's like, oh well, it's not permanent anyway. The way that Earthlings or humans think of it as permanent, and so on is another phrase that he uses a lot. And that's sort of just this idea of like, time keeps moving and nothing is kind of fixed forever. Just to go back to this real fast, another important point here to relate this back to the previous point. This is very similar to what Vonnegut talks about in chapter 1 with the limerick that endlessly repeats. And so the view of life here, the concept of life here, is this endless loop, this repetition that it's not a beginning, a middle, and an end, like a story, as Vonnegut is charted, but it's more an endless loop, and you can't separate one moment from the next because they're all interlinked and interconnected and all present at once. So jumping ahead a little bit to chapter 3 here, I want to focus on a couple important points. One is the serenity prayer that you may be familiar with, that Billy has posted on his office wall. As it says here, it's his method for keeping going, even though he was unenthusiastic about living. And that attitude is pretty much carried throughout Billy's attitude, as far as being unenthusiastic about living, that is carried throughout the various parts of the book, no matter what age or time he's in. He's sort of a passive actor, a bystander to a lot of what goes on around him. But a lot of people, he said, a lot of his patients at least, related to this and agreed with this, that they found a lot of peace in this. And so this is something that's also very familiar or used by Alcoholics Anonymous, this idea of one day at a time, and to not get upset by things that are beyond your control. And so this concept of what brings serenity or peace would be to accept what you cannot change. And as it says here, Billy, among the things that Billy could not change were the past, the present, and the future. And this is going to really get towards Vonnegut's main point in this section, which is the Tralfamadorian concept of or idea that free will is an illusion that humans have, and that it's not a real thing. That these things exist; they've always existed: the past, the present, and the future. And so, as far as the idea of being able to change, you really can't. And that's the message. And so, the idea of what Billy can't change is everything: the past, the present, and the future. But this is really their concept of so it goes. They don't get upset by these things because there's no ability to change them. They're just the acceptance of it is what it is, and you just have to accept that and deal with it. So just to jump ahead a little bit here at the very end of chapter 3, as the book jumps through the various parts of Billy's life and just sort of jumbles them together, the one the major event of his major experience he had of being a prisoner of war, and interspersing that with scenes of his marital life or his childhood, his being kidnapped by the Tralfamadorians. So the train that he was trapped on, the boxcars, and how they were, all the humans were sort of just put in there, and how they were given food and water, and just everything was passed through this caged environment. And this is really foreshadowing and relating directly to what Billy's experience is going to be later when he's taken to Tralfamadore and put in a zoo, a human, the human zoo where, he's a human habitat that's created for him. And later they bring a woman in there with him. That's all going to be what's happening in chapter 5. But this is really foreshadowing that. And this idea of the way it's presented in both senses is this idea of dehumanization, humans as animals, or being treated as animals, and this concept of superiority as far as having power or being able to use superior force against others, if it's in war, if it's a matter of in society, the strong versus the weak, or in the case of what we do to animals in a zoo, where we're the more evolved and higher level creatures. Just like when he goes to Tralfamadore and they kind of look down on him as being inferior or less than, so he's seen as a novelty and worthy of putting on display, like the way that we would display animals in a zoo. So a little bit further into chapter 4, once Billy is kidnapped, they ask him if he has any questions, and he says, "Why me?" And the response is, that's a very earthling question. Why you? Why us, for that matter? Why anything? Because this moment simply is. Have you ever seen bugs trapped in amber? And this is something that's going to. This image is what's going to be referred to, or this image is going to be repeated later in the chapter. And Billy says, "Well, yeah," and he had a paperweight in his office which showed that polished amber with the bugs in it. And they said, "Well, that's just what it is. We're just trapped in the amber of the moment. There is no why." And so this idea of life as random or meaningless, and that it's a very human quality or human instinct, human nature to question and to ask why and to look for meaning and to try to find meaning, but that ultimately there is no meaning beyond, or there's no deeper meaning, and there's really no meaning beyond That's just the way it is. And the Truffamadorians have accepted this and know this to be true, which is why they don't get upset about things. And even when they later talk about the whole destruction of the universe, they know how it's going to end. And he says to them, well, why aren't you worried about it? And they're like, well, or why don't you try to change it? And they're like, well, it's just going to happen. There's nothing really that we can do. And so they're just very accepting of that, which is, going back to that whole concept of the serenity prayer and being able to accept things the way they are, and how that's going to bring you peace of mind and tranquility in your life. And so if we jump ahead here to the end of chapter 4, when Billy says, where am I? This is when he's in the zoo that they've created, the human habitat, and they tell him, well, you're just trapped in another blob of amber. And that's really a way also of looking at him becoming unstuck in time, and that he's just sort of trapped in all these various moments of his life from which there is no escape and there is no change or chance of change, but sort of endlessly reliving these experiences and finding himself over and over again plopped down into these various historical moments, moments within his historical life. And there's never going to be a change. There's never going to be a meaning to it. It's just what his experience is. And so when he talks about this is just sort of wrapping up this whole concept of free will and time as far as from the Truffamadorian perspective. And the Truffamadorian says, look, I see time the way you might see a stretch of the mountains. All time is all time. It doesn't change. It doesn't lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is. Take it moment by moment, and you will find that we are all, as I've said before, bugs in amber. And so this is really a much more detailed explanation of that view that I was referring to earlier, as far as time and as far as lack of change. And what you do notice throughout the book is not just that these individual events don't change, but there's a certain pattern when he references and brings when Vonnegut references and brings in various historical events, whether it's about World War II or it's about the Crusades or a war from the 16th century. It's all, there's a certain level of repetition to it. And maybe you've heard the expression, history repeats. And so this idea that the names and the places may change and the circumstances may change, but ultimately there's a few key components that are always going to be present, that are going to be eternal, and that are just going to play on this endless loop, whether it's individual life or whether it's the life of the earth, the history of the world. And then when Billy brings in this concept of free will, he says, well, you sound like you don't really believe in free will. And the Truffamadorian says, of all the places I've visited, 31 inhabited planets in the universe, and studying reports from 100 more, only on Earth is there really a talk of free will. So this concept of, again, lack of change, lack of agency, lack of free will on the part of an individual, and the way to be happy, or to at least be peaceful, have peace with the world and serenity with the world, is to accept that lack of free will and to accept your limitations. And for whatever reason, Earth is the outlier. It's the one place where this is really a point of emphasis or a belief, in part because the idea here is in part because they don't see the fourth dimension. All right, so make sure that you follow the directions on Veracross about sending me the highlights of the notes for the chapter 2 through 4 review, and then be ready on Thursday for the short-timed essay on chapters 1 through 4 on Slaughterhouse-Five, based on when your class would be scheduled to meet on G-Day. So make sure you check your schedule for that. And as always, feel free to contact me through Teams or email if you have any questions, issues, concerns about this assignment or upcoming assignments. And I'll talk to you guys later. Okay, take care. Bye.